Hi, everyone. So I called this talk Transform Your Security Team with DevOps, but I think I actually probably should have called it Transforming the Rest of Your Business with Security, because that's really what we're doing. So my name is Czarkowski. I am a developer advocate, which immediately brings imposter syndrome on me because I'm a sysadmin, not a developer. But I do write just enough code so I can pull in some of that sweet DevOps paycheck. And we're right before lunch, so I'm going to make a deal. If you continue to laugh at my jokes, I will move through things quicker. If you don't laugh at my jokes, I'll take a very long time. So we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about compliance. We're going to talk about DevOps, which hopefully you're familiar with that topic. And then we're going to talk about the two combined together. So compliance is almost always about risk mitigation and management. It's usually government or legislative created to try and protect consumers, often as a result of some sort of catastrophic event happening that could have been prevented. Different compliance applies to different companies and to different parts of a company. You've got things like PCI Compliance, which is for when you're dealing with credit cards. You've got HIPAA for when you're dealing with the personal identifying information of healthcare and users. You've got Sarbanes-Oxley, which is some companies did some really evil stuff. We should probably try and make sure they can't do that, or at least try and protect our consumers from that. And so that's kind of your regulatory ones. And you've got self-imposed, or things that people you go into business with will impose upon you. And that's usually more self-written, or you're using existing compliance things like the CEI benchmarks and the Security Implementation Technical Guide, or STIG. You're also often doing, okay, we're allowed to use these open source licenses and not those ones because we don't want all of our code to accidentally become AGPL. That would be a bad thing. And then to me, there are three main aspects of compliance. And I come to security from like a DevOps background, so I'm not super hardcore into like the deep technicals of compliance. But I kind of saw there was your compliance, your specs, right? And that's very lengthy documents describing what sort of state you should be in, what sort of controls you should have, that are not necessarily very clear. So then you have someone that's interpreting those and creating controls and checklists and saying, okay, we've got all these like massive PDFs and we're going to convert them into checklists, we're going to turn them into procedures, and we're going to turn them into wiki pages, whatever. And you've got the verification and audit stage where someone internally or someone externally has come along and saying, well, here's your spec, here's your checklist, here's your, do they work together, and are you actually compliant? This is an example of the Security Technical Implementation Guide for Red Hat 6, and it's a really good piece of compliance for me as a systems administrator, right? Because it's telling me exactly what I should be looking for, saying SSH protocol should be set to 2. And it even gives me the commands to run and what to do if it fails. And so I, or anyone else that can log into a Linux system, can see this piece of compliance and enact it on a server and fix it if it's not set right on a server. And it's really easy. This is from PCI, and it's not quite so clear. So it talks about access control to various systems, right? And you really need to have somebody who understands PCI compliance, or someone who has the patience to read this and interpret it into something that people like myself, and also people that own business controls, can actually turn into something that's enacted and make sure that you're compliant. And so you have those people, to me, that's what I see, but a compliance officer actually can read it and understand it, and they not only need to read and understand the compliance doc, but also the business that they're working in and how they do things. So you end up with lots of discovery meetings where you sit in a room for hours describing how your Active Directory or LDAP and what groups are allowed access to what, and how you can then control who's allowed to change user permissions in there, and how they reflect to your servers, and how they're accessed by, how those systems are able to be accessed by those controls. And so they kind of put all that together, and then they kind of then produce the checklists and whatever to say, okay, we are compliant as long as these things are happening. And so a large enterprise will usually break these things up into a bunch of groups, right? Each of those groups responsible for a different part of it, writing the compliance, testing the compliance, configuring the servers, etc. And with compliance kind of being an insurance thing, you're kind of covering your butt in case something happens, you want an audit trail. So these people only talk to each other over tickets or in status meetings or whatever, and you end up with that typical enterprise like siloing of teams or business units. And so we all know what we do with that, right? We rub a little DevOps on it and magically the silos go away. Now hopefully I can speed through this because you've all seen this slide before. You've all seen the 10 deploys a day slide. You've all seen that we go to these conferences called DevOps Days. And we have this thing called CALMS, right? Culture, Automation, Lean, Measurement, and Sharing. And the good thing about this is it kind of applies to any part of the business, not just like your IT and systems engineering. And so we can apply CALMS to security, we can apply CALMS everywhere, to sort of any other part of the business and get benefits. And when we do it right, we create this like OODA loop of continuous improvement, and we keep getting better. We're using lean techniques such as Kanban, value stream mapping, etc., to sort of build our business processes into our infrastructure, into our code, into our security, etc. Did anyone see that there's now a DevOpsDays conference happening in London? So I saw this and I flipped out. I was super mad. I was like, what the hell is going on? Why are we adding extra words? Like, I thought we were trying to resist that, and John Willis is part of organizing it. I'm like, what the fuck is going on? I don't understand. And I was super mad, right? But then I sort of got over that initial anger, and I kind of realized that we actually caused that to happen. We go out, we preach DevOps, we preach inclusiveness, we talk about bringing the whole business into DevOps, but we don't really do that. We just create a DevOps team and tell them to write some chef or some Puppet, right? And just take care of that automation part and miss the rest of that. And then we come to DevOps Days and we talk about culture for 2 days, and then we go home again and write some more chef. So we kind of did it to ourselves. We ignored other aspects of the business, especially teams like security. And so that left them kind of trailing along behind us, trying to just do what they can to secure the garbage that we're dumping out. And to us, it's beautifully crafted infrastructure code. To them, it's insecure garbage, right? And so we then create memes and we make fun of them because, that's what we do, right? And so not only did we not help empower them, but we actually deprived them of their ability to actually get in and help us and do stuff. So they created these terms, rugged DevOps, DevSecOps, secure DevOps, to try and enter the story and to try and include themselves, or at least copy some of the best things of what we do and have their own ways of doing security as code, compliance as code, in the same we do infrastructure as code. And they have an incredible body of work. Like, this is from Fannie Mae, right? They have security and compliance built into their continuous delivery pipeline. They have it built into their application development pipelines. And when they do that, they're actually empowering their developers to own the security experience without having to be security experts in themselves. So this is really where we should be trying to get to. And if we have to call it DevSecOps to make that happen, then let's just do that. John Willis had a blog post, it's just a name, get over it, which I kind of read, and I'm like, okay, I understand what you're saying, and I actually agree now. So I think it's cool that we're doing that conference. I would like to see ways in which we could be doing those things together. But we'll work on that. So let's ignore the term DevOps and just talk about CALMS, right? Because that's really the practice that we're doing, right? We're following those five pillars. So we'll just talk through those. At Pivotal, we build platforms, and we have Cloud Foundry, and then we also have a new Kubernetes platform and a new function platform to kind of tie that across. And we practice compliance as code. We have compliance tests through our entire CD pipeline. We use this tool called Bosh, which is like if you did Kubernetes 5 years ago dealing with VMs and required a PhD to actually operate it, then you would have Bosh. And it's really good for us, and it enables us to do some amazing things. But around compliance as code, security as code, etc. But it's not really for everybody. And so I'm not going to say, well, just rewrite all of your chef in Bosh or rewrite all your Puppet in Bosh, and you'll get these amazing things we get at Pivotal. So I wanted to come out and be pragmatic. How can we, as practitioners that have existing, deployments rather than just, building something new from scratch, how can we start doing this kind of thing? So we rub some CALMS on it. So culture, right? Probably the hardest part of DevOps, especially at a large organization. Behavior sets culture. Incentives drive behavior, and leadership sets incentives. So it's really up to the leadership of the business to actually drive for a DevOps culture or a high-performing culture. Individual teams can sort of have a little bubble of DevOps culture inside a business, but they'll find themselves constantly fighting to retain that bubble, and eventually it will erode and that bubble will disappear. So we need to find ways to get, we need to get leadership invested in actually making those changes. And when you have a DevOps team, you also get a high-performance team, and generally vice versa, right? So if you adopt the practices for one, you end up with the practices for the other. And that's why sort of SRE came up sort of beside DevOps without a lot of interaction, but still basically the same sets of practices. So you have clear and efficient decision-making methods, engaged leadership, high trust, clear communications. You are accepting and even you welcome failure, you do your blameless postmortems, etc. That all creates a DevOps culture or a culture of high-performance teams. So you want to start improving your compliance, you want to start improving your security. So you need a map, right? And you need to know where you are and where you're going to go. So value stream mapping is a very good way to do that. You basically look at what you have right now. You kind of build out your process of what it looks like now. And then you look at that and you'll almost immediately see the obvious bottlenecks, the obvious time waste. And then you build out what you want to get to based on those by eliminating those. And you get a series of work out of that. You throw that into a Kanban board and you have things you can start working on to improve that process. When we're talking about processes that involve security and compliance, usually it's at infrastructure provisioning, you're testing servers to make sure they're compliant before they're allowed to be used. You're releasing applications, you're testing them to make sure they're compliant before they're released to production. And then also you're doing ongoing compliance to make sure that systems and applications are still being compliant and are still secure. And a lot of the tools and techniques you use in one will be reusable in the others. So you can kind of start value stream mapping it all, and you'll start to see which of the ones you should tackle first and keep going. So this is a really badly written value stream map for provisioning a new server. Each of those steps in blue should be a lot more detailed going to every step. But I kind of just wanted to show, in a standard enterprise environment, this is still kind of how you provision a new server. You make a request, you wait a week to a month, and you get a VM. Often that VM is in Amazon. You're like, it really took a month to hit an API to ask for a server, but whatever. So we have a bunch of tasks done by a team, a bunch of waiting time, a bunch of tasks, etc. So we have that. And so we know what our current state is. So how can we improve that? We start doing infrastructure as code, we start doing config management, and then we start doing compliance as code. And so we've shortened up the work involved. There's still waiting times maybe, because there might still be different teams doing it, but we're getting better. But we're really pushing to get to this, push button, receive bacon kind of thing, where we get infrastructure rather than bacon, right? And that's, a lot of us have that right now. We just ignore the security and compliance portion of it. So you do a value stream map, you figure out what all you want to do, how you're going to get there, and you put it into a Kanban board, which is, if you're bringing in new teams into doing agile type stuff, Kanban boards is the best way to go. To do, in progress, done, really simple, right? You don't have to worry about time boxing. Security teams, operations teams, we all have a lot of interrupt-driven work, and there's nothing worse than saying, I'm going to work on these things in this 2 weeks, and then saying, I didn't work on any of those things in that 2 weeks. It's pretty demoralizing. So you've built a bunch of tasks, and it turns out a lot of them have to do with automation. So now I'm going to switch to talking about a little bit about a previous job I had, where I actually helped a security team do some automation around compliance. And so we had these spreadsheets, and there was one of these for every server. There was several thousand servers, and each one had 100, 200 sets of settings that should be set on that server to make sure it was compliant. And people would go through, and they would SSH into our servers one at a time, and they would go through this document, ensure that it was still compliant, and then they would save that off with a timestamp and the server name, and they would go to the next server. We had several thousand servers, so that's basically all a group of, that was 4 people's work, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. By the time they got to the end, they just go straight back to the start again, right? Because months have passed. And I started working with that team. I'm like, whoa, this is crazy. And I'm not mad, because this is how you were taught to work. This is how you've been doing things. But guess what? I can help make this better. I can help automate things, and I can help make your lives better. And they were like, cool. So I introduced them to a few things. I said, so in the engineering org, we're using Ansible, and in the engineering org, we're using server specs. We're using Ansible to set things on a server, and we were using server spec to ensure things were set. So let's try and use similar tools with compliance. So let's use Ansible to enforce compliance, and then let's use inspec, which is like server spec, but specific for doing compliance testing, to do that. And then we had our own internal, like Linux hardening compliance, and it read more like the PCI compliance doc than the STIG compliance doc, so it was very hard to interpret. So the other thing these folks had to do was actually interpret those docs into what settings should be on the server. So I said, let's just take STIG or CIS and implement that, and then figure out what the gaps are, and implement those once we have at least the STIG or CIS. So we did some research. Ansible hardening was a repo that existed that implemented STIG, and inspec STIG was a repo that already existed that checked for STIG on a server. So like, well, we can use these, we can get these out pretty quick, and we can at least be getting like an easy report of how compliant we are for those things. And in implementing that, we can also learn how to use these tools, because the security team was brand new to any kind of DevOps type techniques and tools, etc. So we did that. I said, I'll take care of the initial Ansible to install inspec and to run inspec STIG, and you all go and figure out the differences between inspec STIG and our own compliance, and write the inspec for the rest of our compliance. And then we'll come back, we'll get all that running, and we'll know how compliant we are for ourselves, and then we'll talk about enforcement, because why enforce it if you can't measure it? And so that's what we did. So again, this is the STIG for SSH version 2. This is the inspec for it. Inspec understands what an SSH config is. So I simply say SSH config files protocol should equal 2. And then I add some metadata, I give it some tags and whatnot. And so we have several hundred of these, and when you run inspec, it runs through all of these, verifies it, and gives you a report at the end if you've passed or failed each test. And depending on severities, etc., will like give you a different exit code that you can then, make a monitoring alert or whatever on. So the security team used that as a model and built our own compliance, say for MySQL. And they also took a few extra steps and actually had a remediation tag and a link to the documentation. And because we were using unique codes, everything sort of linked together. And so now, whenever this ran, it would not only tell them that it was out of compliance, but it would tell them exactly how to fix it and where to find more information about it. And that was super powerful. So I did the initial implementation of getting it running on our fleet. We use Ansible, so it took me a couple of days to get this across our fleet of a couple of thousand servers, and we're immediately getting this feedback of what was compliant and what not, because I created a sensu alert to actually run the inspec, and so any inspec checks, pass or fail, showed up in our sensu dashboard, and then all of our inspec checks were also going through to our centralized logging, so we could look in our centralized logging to see that. So this is actually a server spec check, but the inspec one looks exactly the same. In Sensu, and then this is in Kibana. I can easily dive in and see when it ran, how it ran, what was compliant, what wasn't compliant for each server. And so that was super cool. So we had that going. Now we're like, okay, we should start enforcing this stuff, right? We should go through it and actually make sure that we can programmatically make our servers compliant. And so we had the Ansible hardening, which did STIG, and we added our own tasks to do the rest of our stuff. We had to do a lot of testing here because we were making major changes potentially to hundreds of server settings on thousands of servers. So we did a couple of months of testing before we actually rolled this into production. And we did discover that some of the settings would break our applications. So we had to back those off, find out why, remediate it, enable them again. That took a few months, but it also allowed our security team to learn how to use Ansible, learn how to do pull requests, use Git, etc. So it was a very, very useful process. And then we have Jenkins, because everyone has Jenkins, right? Because there's still, in a lot of ways, still no better options for an enterprise. Apologies to anyone here that has an alternative to Jenkins. Yours is actually really good too. And if I was using it, I probably wouldn't hate it like I hate Jenkins. But we have Jenkins that every time we make a pull request to our Ansible repos or to our application repos, we'll do an entire deployment to the cloud and run a bunch of tests. So I was like, well, let's just add 2 lines to run in Spec when we do that. And now we know every time we make a change to our application or to our infrastructure that we're not making a regression in compliance. And that was an easy thing to do, a super easy win, and also gave us another point where we could do measurements. The security team now no longer had to log into thousands of servers to check hundreds of settings, right? InSpec was in monitoring and logging, so we had sort of reports being basically automatically generated. And then we could use that tooling to actually create monthly reports. You know, I can query Elastic and say, give me a monthly report. I can query my monitoring, like give me monthly reports. So that was super cool. And that's measurement. And it's a key part of DevOps. It's a key part of comms. And it's also a key part of compliance, because part of compliance is knowing that you're in compliance. You have to measure this stuff. And with those compliance events being measured into monitoring and logging, I had that data, and so it was a fairly simple state to take that data and turn it into reports that go to auditors, and also reports that go to like leadership to say, this is our current state of compliance for this month. Some things are really easy to measure, like the fact we went from thousands of hours of people typing on keyboards to magic happening. Now, that was easy to measure. We went from tens of thousands of hours to 0 hours. And going to management, leadership, and saying the security and compliance team just reduced tens of thousands of dollars of wasted labor and increased our compliance and the mean time to repair of that compliance. Leadership was pretty happy with the security and compliance team, and they gained a lot of trust, and that was a good thing. And by adding it to our monitoring, we could measure MTTR of compliance issues, we could measure percentage of fleet compliance, and we didn't have to really do a lot of work to get to that because we already had ways to visualize our metrics data. Finally, sharing. So we're sharing the same tools and processes as the rest of the development team into the security and compliance team. And so that meant we had, Ansible, Sensu, Elk, Kibana, InSpec, ServerSpec. So we're sharing all of these. So the amount of things you need to keep in your mind, the amount of tools being used, the amount of cognitive load, the amount of technical debt being created was reduced, it was lower. And that's good because all of those things help keep your errors down, right? We were sharing knowledge and skills into the compliance team. And they were using those knowledge and skills to reduce their manual toil to the point that they could then start working with our teams to start bringing about that security and compliance mindset, where we were starting to actually put security and compliance into our CI/CD pipeline. So now developers were empowered to think about security and compliance as they were writing code, as they were deploying infrastructure. And that was super powerful, and that was awesome. So that is the main part. What is next? So here's a bunch of security and compliance tools that you can do similar to what we did with InSpec to integrate them with your infrastructure, to integrate them with your CI/CD pipeline, etc. And it all covers intrusion detection, penetration testing, API security testing, scanning licenses for dependencies, scanning code bases for contributors to making sure that the right people have been contributed. Pretty much anything you would want to do from like a compliance point of view, you can put into some sort of test that you run in CI/CD. You have some tests like vulnerability scanning. You can run at unit test stage, so you had that very fast fail. Some stuff like the actual running InSpec or doing intrusion detection or stuff like that, maybe you have to run that at integration testing phase after you've done a bunch of deployments, but you're still not doing it manually anymore, so you're still saving a bunch of time, and you're still getting from development to production a lot quicker, and including the security team rather than ignoring them. That is it. I think I've managed to go fast enough to get you some extra time for lunch. Questions?